Well, now we need to finish up the book of Numbers. Chapters 22 through 36 remain to be looked at. This is another discrete section of the book. I might point out that the first 9 chapters were the preparations that were made to leave Mount Sinai, but they were at Mount Sinai during those chapters. Chapters 10 through 21, which we've covered in the last segment, much of it, that was stuff that took place during the 37 or 38 years of wandering. And now in chapter 22, we're at the end of that period because they're now on the plains of Moab, which is where they were when the book was written and where they camped when Moses died and Joshua led them across the Jordan River from that point into the promised land in the next, not the next generation, but the next actions, the next movement. The plains of Moab are over here on the eastern side of the Jordan. And it says Moab down here, but this is part of it too because they were across the river from Jericho. And while they were there, a variety of things happened. One of the most important things is the story that includes Balaam, who is given 3 chapters of consideration. I mean, Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan, were treated in like a paragraph each, where we have this longer story of Balaam. Now, Balaam is recognized in the New Testament as significant enough to mention several times also. He becomes a lesson for Christians, as we shall see. Now, Balaam is a mysterious character. We don't actually know what his nationality was. He was not a Jew. But he had a reputation as a, what should we say? I don't know if he was a shaman or if he was a seer. I mean, we're not really told where he got his qualifications to be viewed the way he was viewed. I'm afraid we got this wrong again. Darn it. I don't know why this sometimes does that. All right, we're right now. But Balaam just is introduced as the son of Beor, or Bozor, it says in the New Testament, but it doesn't really give us any background for the guy. When we first meet him, he's already got a reputation in this region among the heathens as somebody who has spiritual authority of some kind. If he curses someone, they'll be cursed. If he blesses them, they'll be blessed. That's what it says about him. Now, the king of Moab at this time was a guy named Balak. And Balak was afraid because he saw the Israelites coming into his territory. And rightly so, he should be afraid because they were not friendly to him either. They had killed Sihon and defeated his armies. They had killed Og and defeated his armies. And now they recently defeated Arad and defeated his armies. So these guys are winners when it comes to war. And he's afraid of them. So he says, well, my only hope of survival for my people is to bring a curse upon them. So the king, Balak, sent messengers with money to Balaam, wherever he was. And they said, listen, we know that you have the kind of spiritual authority that if you curse someone, they're cursed. If you bless someone, they're cursed. They're blessed. You need to, we want to pay you to come and curse these people that are coming into our territory so that we don't get wiped out by them. And Balaam, interestingly, said, well, let me consult of Yahweh. Now, he actually said Yahweh, even though Yahweh was the God of Israel. And the pagans, Moabites, for example, worshipped Chemosh, a different god. And, everyone except Israel didn't worship Yahweh. Just Israel did. But here he says, I'm going to consult Yahweh. Now, Balaam was not a Jew. He was not an Israelite. So he apparently knew that the Israelites were worshipers of Yahweh. But you see, in those days, the view, we might call the view of the world in those days polytheism, because all the nations believed there were many gods. But there's actually another word, henotheism it's called, H-E-N-O. Henotheism, T-H-E-I-S-M. Henotheism. That was the view that there are many gods, but only one God per nation. every nation had its own sponsor god. So, some gods had Baal, some nations had Baal, some had Moloch, some had Chemosh, some had these different deities. And they believed that Israel's God was Yahweh. They believed that Yahweh was a real God, but that he's just one of many gods, and he was the national God for the Israelites, as other gods were national gods for other nations. Generally speaking, it was thought that if two nations war and one wins over the other, it was because the nation that won had a stronger God, and the one who lost had a weaker God. In fact, when God later in Israel's history had to judge them and allowed the Babylonians to destroy them, God says, I've had to risk my own reputation. Now they're going to think the Babylonian gods are stronger than me. They're not. They don't understand I'm giving you over to them as a judgment, but my name is going to be blasphemed among the heathen because you forced me to do this to you, because they're going to interpret this. They know Yahweh's real, but they're going to think their gods are stronger than Yahweh because they conquered Yahweh's people. So Balaam believed that Yahweh was a real God. He was probably willing to serve anyone who paid him enough. And so when it comes to cursing Israel, he thought, I'd better talk to Yahweh about this. Now, the man apparently had, mystical connections with demons, and even Yahweh spoke to him. And Yahweh said, don't do it. These people are blessed. You cannot curse them. So Balaam, fearing Yahweh at that point, went out and told the people who had been sent to him, sorry, can't take the job. Yahweh said that these people are blessed and they can't be cursed. So the messengers of Balak went back to him and reported, I'm sorry, he wouldn't take the job. Well, Balak thought, well, this is really more important than I think Balaam realizes. I'm going to be wiped out if he doesn't agree to this. So he sent more money. And he said, listen, ask for anything. I'll give you more money, whatever, just come and do it. Well, Balaam, strangely, did not say, listen, I gave you my answer. He said, well, let me go check with Yahweh again. Mm-hmm. Now, this is where he made his mistake. God had already given him an answer that should apply to all time. These people are my people. They're blessed. They can't be cursed. But now that the money's more, he's going to see if he can maybe get God to change his mind, I guess. And so he goes and talks to Yahweh, and Yahweh said, yeah, go ahead. Go curse them. No, he actually said, go ahead and go with these men, but only say what I tell you to say. But Yahweh was angry at him for asking again. God was not going to let him curse the people, as we shall see. But he was upset that Balaam still wanted to try it again, just because he was motivated by a higher fee being offered. And so when Balaam saddled his donkey to go off with these men to Balak and do the job, God was angry that he did it and put an angel in his way with a sword. Balaam, though he was a man of unusual spirituality, couldn't see the angel. The donkey could. And the donkey would swerve to avoid the angel. Eventually the angel came to stand in a narrow place where the donkey couldn't swerve without crunching Balaam's foot up against the rock walls. And each time the donkey swerved to miss the angel, Balaam didn't understand what was going on. He just started beating the donkey, punishing it. And when it hurt his foot, he really beat it mercilessly. And then God opened the donkey's mouth, it says, and the donkey said, why are you beating me like this? And Balaam said, because I'm angry at you for hurt my foot. The donkey said, well, all the years I've served you, have I ever done that kind of thing before? Now, this is a rather strange story, unique, in fact. The Bible doesn't have any other cases of God letting animals talk. We do have a snake that talks in the Garden of Eden, but that's the devil doing. This is God opening the donkey's mouth. But what makes the story stranger is that Balaam has a conversation with the donkey without realizing something's out of kilter here. The guy was so angry, he answered the donkey and says, whoa, did you say something? And is that words I heard coming out of your mouth? And so and then the donkey just says, listen, I've never acted this way before, have I? Get a clue, there's something out of the ordinary here. And then the angel allowed himself to be seen by Balaam, and Balaam said, you should thank your donkey, because if he hadn't stopped you, I would have killed you. And Balaam said, well, what's up? What do you want me to do? And the angel said the same thing that God had said to him. You can go ahead, but only say what God gives you to say. Now, it would appear, and this is not stated in so many words, but there are some hints of it, that when Balaam began to prophesy or give his blessings and curses, or what, he would go into a trance. There is reference in his speeches, and he gives several of them that are recorded in these chapters. There's reference to him being the seer who falls down in a trance and stuff like that. So, in other words, he couldn't just say what he wanted to say. When he went into this trance-like state, what came out of his mouth was not under his control. And what happened is when he came to Balak, Balak would take him to various places to view the children of Israel in the distance and to curse them. And when Balaam would begin to prophesy, only blessings for Israel would come out of his mouth. He was unable to curse them, though he wanted to, because he wanted the money. But he was incapable of doing it. And Balak got madder and madder. He said, why are you, I paid you to curse them, not bless them. Why do you keep doing this? He said, listen, I can only do what Yahweh says. I can, what Yahweh puts in my mouth is all I can speak. And so Balaam never did curse Israel. And Balak was upset with him and sent him packing, sent him back home. Now, we don't read anything more about Balaam immediately until a little bit later. What happened next, and what is recorded in chapter 25, is the sin of Israel at what's called Baal Peor. Peor is a location where Baal was worshipped by the pagans. Well, what happened there in that story is that the men of Israel began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab and Midian, the local pagans in the region. And this was apparently part of worshiping Baal at Baal Peor. Baal Peor was a place where Baal was worshipped by the heathen. And these pagan religions, these Canaanite religions, we know from many sources, archaeological and otherwise, that their religious rituals were orgies, really. That's one of the things that was awful about the Canaanites, is that they worshiped their demon gods with orgies and often offered infants as sacrifices while they had their orgies. It's a pretty gross kind of religions that God said they had to be wiped out. But apparently the men of Israel got involved in this. They were worshiping Baal. They were getting involved in the orgies. They were having sex with the local women. And a plague came on Israel. God plagued them at Baal Peor. And this is referred back to many times in the later scriptures, talking about what happened at Baal Peor, where God plagued them, and 24,000 of them were killed by this plague. 24,000 Jewish men, Israelite men. So the plague ended when a particular Israelite and his prostitute or his consort or whatever went into a tent to fornicate, and the grandson of Aaron, Phinehas, grabbed a spear or a javelin and ran in there and thrust them both through while they're in the act and killed them both, pinned them to the bed like a toothpick through a big hamburger, you know. And just to give you sort of a mental picture, pleasant as it is. And because Phinehas did this, the plague stopped. No more than the initial 24,000 Israelites died. And God said, because of the zeal of Phinehas, I'm going to call off the plague here. And Phinehas was, of course, commended by God for this kind of zeal in doing this thing. Well, what we are not told at that point is something that comes out later. In chapter 31, Moses has the children of Israel mobilized to go out to war against the Midianites and the Moabites, who are the ones that were involved in this thing with Israel, and has them kill them off. Not all of them, but the men and the women who had been involved in this incident. Some of the soldiers, not being disposed to kill women, I mean, you know, men's conscience would draw the line at some places, and the women were taken as captives rather than as killed in battle. And Moses said, no, they should have been killed. They're the ones who brought this plague on Israel. And so you have to kill them. But it's in chapter 31, interestingly, Moses makes this point that we are not told earlier. In chapter 31, verse 16. It says, Moses said, "Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident of Peor." Now, he said it was through the counsel of Balaam they did that. We hadn't read that. We do read earlier in chapter 31, in verse 8, that Balaam also got killed in that battle. That as they were wiping out the enemies, Balaam was among them and got killed. He came to his end in this. But we had not read earlier of Balaam's involvement at all in this Baal-Peor incident. All we had read is that he had failed to curse Israel and been discharged from the job and gone home. Next thing we read, he's killed in this battle. And then Moses says it was Balaam's counsel that caused these women to come and do that. What we have to assume, I think, is that Balaam, still eager to receive the money for the job, said to Balak, you know, and we have confirmation of this in the book of Revelation, which I'll show you in a moment. He said to Balak, you know, I can't curse these people. God won't let me. But I know how you can bring a curse upon them. Get them involved with your gods. Send your pretty women in there to seduce them into sexual behavior that gets them to compromise into the worship of Baal, Peor. This was the counsel of Balaam, and it's through his counsel that they did this, it says. Moses said that. So that bring, God himself would curse them for that, and he was right. 24,000 of them were killed by God in a plague. So Balaam was apparently able to collect his fee after all. Now, in Revelation chapter 2, we have this scenario confirmed for us as Jesus is writing or sending a letter to the church of Pergamos and criticizing them for their compromises. And in chapter 2, verse 14, Jesus says, "But I have a few things against you." Excuse me. "I have a few things against you," he says, "because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality." So we can see that it's not just the sexual immorality, it was related with the worship of Baal. Eating things sacrificed to idols is part of the worship of those gods. So he says that the doctrine of Balaam is in that church, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, getting them to commit sexual immorality and to eat meat sacrificed to idols. That is, he got them involved in pagan idolatry and sexual immorality. Now, in what sense are there people who teach the doctrine of Balaam in the church of Pergamos? Well, it seems pretty clear in the early church, some of the things the early church struggled with, especially in the Gentile lands, was staying aloof from sexual immorality and from idolatry. We have to understand that we have been raised in countries that at least have some Christian heritage. There aren't temples to Zeus, there aren't temples to Aphrodite, there aren't temples to, Diana, the goddess, in our towns where we grew up. But in all the pagan world there were temples to all these false gods in all the pagan world. And one of the greatest social events was when they'd have a great feast to worship these gods. They'd sacrifice, hundreds or thousands of cattle, and they'd burn part of it on the altar to these gods, and they'd feed the community with it. They'd have these big public feasts. Eating meat sacrificed to idols was eating at one of these feasts, usually, where they were serving it to the public, and you go to these feasts to have a free meal, or maybe you'd pay, I don't know. But the point is, you would participate in the celebration of that deity by eating meat that had been sacrificed to that deity, the remnants of it. Now, this is what the Christians in the pagan world were often tempted to do, because these feasts were sort of a center of social life for the pagans. And there was the allure also that the pagan gods were often worshipped through sexual immorality. For example, the temple of Aphrodite, which was in Corinth, had 1,000 priestesses who were prostitutes. And when a man would go to worship at that temple, he'd pay to sleep with a prostitute who was a priestess. That was part of his worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And so also immorality was often a part of the pagan worship. Now, the Christians, of course, in these pagan lands were not raised Jewish. They were raised pagan. They had been involved in all this all their lives. It had not been considered immoral. It was part of their religion. So it was hard for them to, when they became Christians, to connect. The Jews who became Christians already had a sense of moral behavior sexually. They didn't always follow it, but they knew what God had said about sexuality in the Old Testament. The pagans had none of that background. To them, there were forms of sexual behavior that were part of worship of their deities. So they become part of a religious community that says, no, all fornication is sin. It's wrong. Well, it's one thing to be told that. It's another thing to feel that. I mean, let's face it. We have been raised in a society that's been far more influenced by Christianity than by paganism. But we still find Christians sometimes having a hard time fighting off sexual immorality because our media and the advertising and simply the morals of our community, they don't stigmatize fornication anymore. There was a time in my parents' generation, if a girl got pregnant in high school, it was a scandal. They'd send her off to another town to be raised by her aunt, and she'd just disappear so no one had to face it. In my time, of course, in the hippie movement days, fornication became far more, people became more loose about it. The hippies advocated free sex and drugs and rock and roll, all that stuff. But it was still scandalous. I mean, the hippies were still considered scandalous by the older generation because of their fornication, because of their free sex. Nowadays, it's not even considered scandalous. In fact, it's considered weird if you go out on a date and you don't have sex after second or third date with the same person. What? You know, I mean, I've actually talked to Christian single women who said that they've dated single Christian men who said if they don't have sex by the third date, they're not going to date them anymore. These are supposed to be Christians. This is how sexual morals have been corrupted in the Western world among the non-Christians. And those Christians who've come up in that and then become Christians, it's hard to shake loose from that kind of ethic. And also for them to avoid going to the temples, to the pagan temples, to eat the meat. So there were people in the early churches. You find them in Corinth because Paul addresses it in Corinthians. You find them in the church of Pergamos in Revelation, and also in the church of Thyatira. There was a woman named Jezebel, or so-called, who was teaching the same thing. It's okay. We're under grace. We don't have to live a holy life. You want to eat the sacrifices at the pagan temples? You want to have fornicate? Go ahead. God's easy. You know, we're under grace, not under law. This is the kind of stuff they were teaching. And you don't find very many people teaching in the church today that it's okay to fornicate. They don't say that. But if someone is found to be fornicating, they don't speak against it. There's a lot of churches that are saying, well, how can we complain? We're under grace, none of us are perfect. Well, under grace doesn't mean you can go out and sin. And Jesus said he hated that teaching. And he had it against the church, that they tolerated it. So we need to be aware that that's what Balaam counseled people to do. Jesus calls that the counsel of Balaam, the doctrine of Balaam, which is something, if the church adopts at all, it's a loose attitude toward sexual morality, essentially. And Christ will hold the church accountable for that and judge them for it. But there's something more about Balaam that the New Testament brings out. 2 Peter chapter 2 and Jude both mention the same thing about Balaam. You'll find it in 2 Peter 2, verse 15. 2 Peter 2:15. Peter's talking about false teachers that are in the church. And he says, they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Now, what it's saying is he wanted to get paid even though what he's doing is wrong. He was a mercenary. He had some religious reputation of being a man who had spiritual authority, but he was in it for the money. And he wanted to curse Israel. God wouldn't let him, but he wanted to. He loved the wages that one gets from doing what's unrighteous. And Jude tells us that same thing in the book of Jude. verse 11, speaking about false teachers. He says, "Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah." So he mentions Cain, Korah, and Balaam, but he says they've gone in the way of Balaam for profit. Now, this is basically saying that there were teachers in the church who were in it for the money. Now, Paul warned Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 to avoid that temptation to do ministry for money. In 1 Timothy 6, he says in verse 3, "If anyone teaches otherwise and does not consent to the wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords to godliness, that man is proud, knowing nothing, but is obsessed with disputes and arguments over words, from which come envy, strife, revilings, evil suspicions, useless wranglings of men of corrupt minds and destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of getting gain. From such withdraw yourselves." He said there are people who think that living the Christian life is a way of getting rich. Now, by the way, there are those who teach that as an official doctrine. If you have enough faith, you get rich. It's called the prosperity doctrine. It's called the word of faith doctrine. He said, turn away from those people. They don't know what they're talking about. He went on to say to Timothy, "Now godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into this world. It certainly will carry nothing out. Having food and clothing, with these we will be content." We'll be content to just have food and clothing, he said. Our ministry is not to get rich. And a person who does ministry to get rich is following the way of Balaam and the way of the false teachers. By the way, the early church had a document called the Didache, spelled D-I-D-A-C-H-E. It's the Greek word for teaching, the teaching. It's called the Didache. And it was a very well-respected book in the early church. It was written around the end of the first century, in the generation after the apostles had died. And it was so well-respected that some wanted to put it in the New Testament. Because although it was not written by the apostles, it did represent the normal teachings of the church at that time. And when you read the Didache, it's kind of interesting because it talks about how to recognize false teachers, or false, it calls them prophets, when they come to the church, visiting prophets. It says things like, if they stay longer than 3 days, they're a false prophet. Because they're leeching off the church, essentially. And it also says, if they ask for money, they're a false prophet. The early church thought if a minister asks for money, he's false. You might say, but how's a minister supposed to live? He's supposed to live trusting God. That's how. He serves God for free. Now, the church, those who are served by him are supposed to voluntarily do something to help him. But if he asks for it, he's a mercenary. Jesus told the disciples when he sent them out 2 by 2 in Matthew chapter 10, he said, "Freely you've received, freely give." That is, when you're ministering to people, you don't ask for money, you don't ask for pay. You give it freely. If you're doing God's work, he'll provide for you. But you won't have to charge for it. If you charge for it, you're turning ministry into a business. And that's forbidden by Christ. So, professional ministry is hard to justify scripturally. What is professional ministry? It's ministry that you get hired for a fee, a salary, to minister. Well, then you're a businessman, not a minister. Minister means servant. When you are a missionary, when you're a teacher, when you're an evangelist, when you're doing God's word and serving, you do it as a service to God. Leave it to him to provide for you, and he will. Frankly, I'll just testify. I've lived by faith for 48 years. What that means is I've been in ministry, and I've never taken a salary from anyone. I've never worked for an organization for pay. I've never asked for money from anyone, and I won't. I won't even let people know what my needs are. That's a conviction I had when I was 16. I still have. I was influenced by George Mueller, Hudson Taylor, Rees Howells, and other people of the 19th century who lived that way and did great things for God. They never told anyone their needs. They just told God their needs. They just did their work for God and let God worry about the money. Can we do that safely? Well, Jesus said, if you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, what? All these things will be added to you. What things? In the context, food and clothing. He says, don't worry about clothing. Don't worry about food. God clothes the flowers. They don't worry about it. God feeds the birds. They don't worry about it. He's going to feed you. He'll clothe you. But just seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. God will give it to you. He'll give you what you need. And to turn ministry into a profession, I don't know how you can do that and not be seen it, kind of as a money-making situation. Now, I realize there are pastors who would serve for free because that's where their heart is. But they're in a position in church where they do get a salary. There's nothing wrong with the church paying a guy something for what he does. What it would be wrong is for him to demand something, to say, I won't work unless I get paid. And that attitude is sometimes encouraged. I don't know if I told you or someone else recently, it may have been someone somewhere else. I have a friend who went to the graduation at a seminary. And the commencement speaker was telling the seminary students, he's saying, you guys now have an education comparable to a medical doctor or a lawyer. So you, when you serve churches, should command a salary similar to a lawyer or a doctor. And my friend who was there, he was just shocked. He was thinking about going to the seminary. He thought, I'm not going anywhere to teach that kind of heresy. You're supposed to see yourself, now that you're trained to minister, that you should command a salary like a secular professional. That mentality it exists, and it's even being taught sometimes to professional ministers. That's a matter of concern to me, because then the minister sees his ministry as a job. And then, of course, there's financial motivations. You want to teach what the people who are giving the most money to you say. I think it was Amos in the Old Testament who said these false prophets, they'll prophesy to anyone who puts food in their mouth, whatever they want. What do you want to hear? Feed me and I'll tell you, Unfortunately, there are ministers who are refusing to speak out true things that need to be said because they know it'll offend the congregation. If you lose members of the congregation, you lose tithers. You lose supporters. Instead of trying to please God and let God provide, many people are strongly tempted, especially if they have big mortgages on their churches and they have big salaries and things like that, and they've got big houses they're paying for, big cars they're paying for. It's scary to think about losing support. But Paul said, we'll be content with just food and clothing. We're not going to be, we're going to be content with a few things. And that's the minister's attitude in the Bible. And even in the 2nd century, if a minister asked for money, he was a false prophet. That was given. Yes, you had a question, didn't you?
Yeah, I was curious. How does when missionaries pretty much we have to ask for supporters sometimes? How does that fall in line?
If I were in the position to ask for support, and I've never done that, I would simply let people know I am going to be doing such and such activities. It's going to have some expenses associated with it. If you're interested in knowing how much, I'll be glad to let you know. But just know that I will be depending on the generosity of people who believe in what I'm doing. And if you feel like you want to support what I'm doing, here's an address you can do that at. You can send money to this or whatever, do it this way. In other words, you shouldn't be begging. Now, I have a radio program that's on every day. It costs us over $50,000 a month to be on the air because we pay for radio time on 20-something stations, and one station alone charges almost $1,000 a month. Excuse me, almost $1,000 a day. Excuse me. And so radio station time is very expensive, and we pay over $50,000 a month to radio stations for our show to start up. We don't raise funds. I don't have deep pockets. I don't have a lot of money myself, so I can't pay those bills. But I have no problem telling my audience we are listener supported. We don't have advertisers, we don't have sponsors, we don't have an underwriting church or something like that. We just depend on the listeners. I don't feel there's anything wrong with telling them that. I don't tell them what our needs are. Sons of her father. She can have her husband's inheritance. Maybe he's not that wealthy, so it may be a step down in some cases, or up, depends. The point is, though, a man who had no sons wouldn't have, on this system, anyone to leave his stuff to. And there was a man who had several daughters, a man named Zelophehad. He had several daughters and no sons. And those daughters came to Moses in chapter 27 and said, you know, our father didn't have any sons, so his inheritance will be passed out of the family because there's no sons to give it to. But we are his daughters. Perhaps we should receive the inheritance that the sons would have received if there had been sons. And so God says to Moses, they're right. They've got a good case there. A man who has no sons, his daughters can inherit it. So that's what's decided in chapter 27. The subject is revisited in chapter 36 because the men of Israel come and they say, well, actually it's the men of the same tribe as the daughters of Zelophehad. They come to Moses and say, if these daughters marry men who are outside the tribe, then what Zelophehad left to them will go into the other tribe because the man they marry will receive what they had. And that means that if the land was in their tribe, it switches hands to the tribe of their husbands when they get married. And therefore, this tribe actually loses part of the tribal inheritance to another tribe. It's kind of complicated. We don't worry about these kinds of things in our modern society. But the idea was, if these daughters have inherited from their father his inheritance, which is of a certain tribe, and they marry a man from a different tribe, then that inheritance that they have comes over into that tribe and becomes the inheritance of their ancestors, or descendants, in this other tribe. Which means the land that belonged to this one tribe that these daughters were born into now becomes permanently the land of a different tribe, which isn't supposed to happen. That's what chapter 36 is about. So God says, they're right about that too. And he says, therefore, if a man has only daughters and they inherit his estate, they can only marry men of their same tribe. That way, the land stays in the same tribe. That's basically what's decided in chapter 36. These issues perhaps don't make much sense or are not great concern to us. It's a very different kind of society. We don't care about tribes and things like that. But they did. And so that's what is dealt with in chapter 27. Basically, chapter 27, the decision is made that daughters of a man who have no sons can inherit as sons would have inherited. The chapter 36 is, however, daughters in that position can only marry men in their own tribe, or else they forfeit their inheritance. Presumably, they could marry someone outside their tribe if they wished, but they can't take the inheritance with them out of the tribe. They have to. The land has to stay in the same tribe forever. So they can either marry someone in their own tribe, in which case they retain their father's inheritance into the next generation, or if they marry outside their tribe, they lose it. Yes? Go ahead.
So would the general rule of thumb be that they could technically intermarry amongst the other tribes unless the situation were to occur?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, there was no mandate in the law that an Israelite of one tribe could not marry someone of another tribe. Mm-hmm. Of course, if a girl from one tribe married a man from another tribe, her children, her family would be of her husband's tribe after that. We know that kind of intermarriage happened a lot because, first of all, it wasn't forbidden. So, I'm sure that people fell in love with people who were of other tribes and married them. We know, for example, that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was of the tribe of Judah. And Elizabeth, who is of the tribe of Levi and a daughter of Aaron, was a relation of hers. We don't know how close a relation or what kind of relation. Could have been a second or third cousin or something like that, but they were somehow related. And that means that someone between the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Levi had intermarried somewhere back there, so that they both came from some union that had both tribes mixed. But we don't know exactly where or how. For example, if Elizabeth was descended directly from Aaron in the tribe of Levi, a possibility would be that Mary's mother also was of the tribe of Levi, related to Elizabeth, but married a man of Judah. So that Mary was born of the tribe of Judah because her father was of Judah. And so she's the intermarriage between the tribes was not forbidden, and so something like that happened in Mary's ancestry, and probably many other cases as well. Now, they weren't even necessarily forbidden to marry Gentiles, but that was frowned on. They were forbidden to marry Canaanites, and also if they married Moabites or Ammonites, they'd be excluded from the tabernacle for 10 generations. So there'd be some penalty for marrying certain heathen, but marrying heathen in general was not forbidden specifically. Just Canaanites, they weren't supposed to marry them. And God even made exceptions for that. Rahab was a Canaanite. She married a man of Judah and became an ancestress of Jesus. Jesus was descended from Rahab, and who was a Canaanite woman who married a Judah man. But she converted. So it's not so much that God is against interracial marriage. He's against interfaith marriage. He forbade marriage to the Canaanites because the Canaanites were pagans. But Rahab was a pagan who became a believer in Yahweh and became a Jewess by religion, and therefore the forbidding of marrying her was off. So he considers no really concern about race as much as it is about religion. God doesn't want the Jews marrying people who aren't of the same religion. Okay, so the daughters of Zelophehad, we have that business there. Chapters 28 and 29 we won't go into detail about. Basically that talks about the order of the offerings at the festivals. The three festivals where the Israelites had to present themselves before the Lord. They had a week-long Passover, a week-long Pentecost, a week-long Sukkot, or Feast of Tabernacles. And there were a lot of, during those weeks, there were a lot of sacrifices to be offered. And chapters 28 and 29 go into detail about those sacrifices. I might just say this, that I mentioned earlier there are some people who think that the temple should be rebuilt and that kind of stuff in the end times. Again, they're understanding some scriptures very differently than I understand the same scriptures, but they also sometimes feel like we should start keeping the festivals of Israel, at least the ones that have not been fulfilled. Now, Passover and Pentecost have been fulfilled, but they say the Feast of Tabernacles has not been fulfilled, so we should start keeping it. And there are Christians actually who go to Israel every fall, or at least sometimes in the fall, and they observe the Feast of Tabernacles, which actually just passed on our calendar. It's just gone by. And I have a friend who went over there for this Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what's ironic about this is they act as though we're supposed to keep the festivals, but if you read the instructions, the festivals involve animal sacrifices every day. I mean, it's like the central activity of these festivals is to offer animal sacrifices in the temple. And there isn't a temple in Jerusalem, and there won't be, unless they rebuilt it. But it's been gone for 2,000 years almost. And so you can't keep the Feast of Tabernacles Day, not in the way that the Bible says to keep it. Fortunately, we don't have to, because that's part of the law. That's part of the shadow. Paul said, let no one judge you what you eat or drink, or whether you keep festivals, or new moons or Sabbaths. Those were a shadow. That's Colossians 2, 16 and 17. So the sacrifices that had to be offered at these festivals, there's detail about that in chapters 28 and 29. Chapter 30 is a law about vows. Now this is an interesting subject. If you take a vow, you're supposed to keep the vow. This is very strongly emphasized in Ecclesiastes 5. It says, if you take a vow, you better keep it, because God has no pleasure in fools. Better to not take a vow at all than to vow and don't keep it. Now, what is a vow? A vow is a promise you make basically to God in this case. And what would people vow? It was voluntary. You didn't have to make vows. But if you made one, you have to keep it. All right? So you might vow to give, some extra sheep to God the next festival. Or if you get a windfall in your business, you might vow that you're going to give additional money besides your tithe to God. You vow something to him. Now, in the book of Judges, we have the story of Jephthah vowing that whatever meets him at the end of the battle, if he wins, he's going to, whatever comes out of his house and meets him, he's going to offer to the Lord. It turned out to be his daughter, which caused a bit of a crisis we won't get into right now. Whoever teaches Judges will have to worry about that one. Yeah. But the thing is, when you make a vow, you keep it. And even it says Jephthah, though he grieved over it, he actually fulfilled his vow. Because an honest person will fulfill their vows. In fact, if you'll look at Psalm chapter 15, there's those Nikes again. In Psalm 15, verse 1, says, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? Now it's God, who will you allow to worship you in the place where you're worshipped? And the answer is he who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil with his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. Then this last line of verse 4, who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money to usury, nor does not take bribe against the innocent, he who does these things shall never be moved. You can have access to God if you do these things. If you don't do these things, in other words, he's upset with you, and the people who are going to dwell in his tabernacle are not the people who do those things. What's it mean to swear to your own hurt and not change? Swearing means taking a vow. I swear by God I'm going to do this. I swear that I'm going to fulfill this promise. Now, if you swear to your own hurt, that's what Jephthah did. He swore, and it ended up being to his own hurt, because he swore he'd sacrifice whatever came out of his house. And then his daughter unexpectedly came out, and it hurt him. But he didn't change. He swears to his own hurt, but he doesn't change. In other words, you make a promise to God, it turns out to hurt. You didn't realize it was going to cost you so much. But you don't say, well, I'm out of this. You keep your vow anyway. The idea is you keep your vow even if it's going to cost you far more than you knew when you vowed it would. I actually think that when people get married, they are often swearing to their own hurt because they're making a vow before God and man. And they're going to forsake all others and cleave only to their spouse, love and cherish until they die. Basically is the promise. It's a lifelong commitment. When a Christian makes that commitment, they shouldn't break it. But many people swear that, most people who get married do swear that, and they swear to their own hurt, in the sense that they're enamored with the person when they marry him. But when they live with them, they find out it's more of a challenge than they thought it was going to be. They thought it was going to be like Cinderella and Prince Charming. They didn't believe that he's going to snore. He's going to drool in his sleep. He's going to leave whiskers all over the sink when he shaves. And he's going to, leave his underwear on the floor. I mean, this isn't Prince Charming. This is just some kind of a uncouth guy, and men often find their wives are not all they thought they would be too. By the way, just so you know, you women, men, when they get married, kind of expect their wives to be very sexually responsive. And what men often find is wives have their times of the month. Sometimes they're responsive, sometimes not. They have their little moods and so forth. I mean, this is just reality. Single people who've never been married may have heard this before. They haven't learned it. The one they want to marry, no, she's perfect. It'll be blissful. I swear I'll stay with her forever. Then you marry them, and you find out it's not as blissful sometimes. Now, I just want to say this. I've been married for 7 years to my present wife. It's been blissful. It's been a wonderful marriage. I was married before to a woman who cheated on me and left me. I wouldn't divorce her, but she divorced me, so I'm free. And I had another wife who died. So, I've been through more than one marriage, unfortunately, but I've been married for 7 years to what I consider to be a perfect wife, just as perfect as I hoped she would be before I married her. But I've had other marriages, and I know something about marriage. Besides that, I've been in the ministry, so I talk to a lot of people with marriage problems. And everyone who has marriage problems didn't expect that when they married. The wedding is such a great celebration. I finally get to take this woman home. I finally get to live with this man. This is going to be great. This is what I've been waiting for all my life. And you get home, and often, it might be within days, or it could be within a few years, you realize, this is kind of bland here, or it's awful. Sometimes it's awful. And what is it? You've sworn. But you didn't know how much it was going to hurt to keep your vow. But those who will dwell in the presence of God, they swear to their own hurt, but they don't change. As they don't say, well, I'm out of here. You make a vow to the Lord, you better keep it. He has no pleasure in fools. Better not to make the vow in the first place than to vow and not keep it. That's Psalm, of course, that's Psalm 15, verse 4, but also Ecclesiastes 5. Now, the law of vows is found in chapter 30 of Numbers, and I'll just say this about it, that it says if you take a vow, you have to keep it. Now, it does say if a wife makes a vow and her husband doesn't know about it, she's bound to keep it, of course, because she's made a vow. But if the day her husband learns of it, he cancels it, then she's not obligated to keep it. This is no doubt partly because of economic things. A very pious woman might vow, to give God half the livestock of their farm, and the husband, when he hears it, what? Are you crazy? No, I cancel that. Now, usually, you make a vow, you have to keep it, you're not out of it. But the husband had the right to cancel it on the day he heard of it. If he doesn't cancel it the day he heard of it, they got to carry it out. And then it says the same thing is true of a girl still in her father's home, a girl who doesn't have a husband yet, she's in her father's home. If she makes a vow of some kind, she has to keep it, except when her father hears it. If he cancels it the same day, she doesn't have to keep it. But if he doesn't cancel it the same day, then she has to keep it. So all that's really being said in this is that vows have to be kept, period, except if a wife or a daughter has made a vow without her husband or father knowing about it, then of course it's going to involve his estate, it's going to involve his finances, the family finances. He's got the final say about it. He can say, no, I don't agree with that. But he has to do it the first day he hears about it. If he lets it slide, then they've got to keep it. That's what chapter 30 is about. Was there a hand up there about this? Okay. Let's okay, yes.
Actually, is there any type of that with Christ being we're his bride, or no?
I think so, yeah, us being the bride. When you are baptized, it's like you're putting on the wedding ring, You've agreed to be the follower of Christ. You've agreed to be part of his bride, okay? You can never legitimately get out of that. Now, some people do. Not legitimately, but some people backslide. They are breaking their promise. Because becoming a Christian is a promise you're making of sorts. You're entering into a covenant. In a covenant, both people make promises. A bride and a groom, they both promise. And they both are supposed to keep their promise. When we come to Christ, we're entering into a marriage covenant. I agree, Christ, I will follow you. You're my king. You're my Lord. You're my husband. And he promises things to us. He'll never break his promise. But people sometimes do. But taking a vow, it applies to marriage, which is something most people will get involved in at some time in their life. Not all, but most. But every Christian is kind of making that kind of a vow to Christ when they become a Christian. That's what baptism is, essentially. It's kind of a vow. I'm going to follow Christ now. And so, we better not back out of that. And I often wonder when people have backslidden, think, why do you think it's okay to break your vow to God? I don't understand how you think that's going to be okay somehow for you. God doesn't like people to break their vows. And the reason is he wants people to be like him, faithful. You promise something, you should keep it. Now, Jesus went so far as to say in the Sermon on the Mount, you shouldn't even have to take oaths. Just be honest. Don't even bother with the oaths because you don't need them. You can just say yes, and you should carry it out as if you'd vowed it. You should say no, and it should be no just as much as if you'd vowed it. You should be internally, in character, like God, honest. You make a promise, you keep the promise. And you should do so whether you have a vow or not. That's what Jesus is saying. Vows were there to keep people honest who might otherwise be tempted to be dishonest. Jesus said, stay honest with or without a vow, basically. Just be honest. Now, very quickly, because we're now just about out of time, let me run through real quickly what's at the rest. After the law of vows is chapter 31, there's a war of vengeance against the Midianites and the Moabites who had seduced the men at Baal Peor. Now, the men at Baal Peor, of course, were responsible for their own sins of being seduced, and they had gotten killed. 24,000 of them got killed by a plague from God. But the seducers had gotten away pretty much scot-free. And so a war was waged. Moses marshaled an army with 1,000 soldiers from each tribe. So it's an army of 12,000 soldiers. And they went and defeated the Midianites. That's where Moses was upset, because the women who had been involved in the seduction were spared by the Israeli soldiers. Just because, men usually don't want to kill women. There's a certain chivalry that's natural, I would think. And so they didn't want to. But Moses said, hey, these women are just as responsible as men. Now, sometimes people don't think women are as responsible as men. When they hear that God told Joshua, kill all the men and women and children, because they're women and children, you don't want to kill women and children. Well, the children is an issue you have to talk about, so, got to deal with that issue. But women and men are adults. Women and men can be equally good or bad. A woman is as responsible for her choices as a man is. A lot of times, men are by nature sympathetic toward women. I realize that our culture is saying, no, white men are oppressors of women. They're all oppressors. I've actually never met, I haven't met 1 in 100 of men I know who are oppressors of women. I've maybe met a few. But most men are protective of women, naturally protective of women. And so God says, well, listen, don't let your sentiments get the better of you. These women are just as guilty as the men. And so they need to suffer too in that case. Chapter 32 is the inheritance of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh on the east side of Jordan. Remember, they conquered Sihon and Og over here on the east side of the Jordan, not in the promised land, outside the promised land, but they were great pasture lands, and these tribes had a lot of flocks. And they came to Moses and said, is it okay if we take our portion over here? And Moses said, you're going to anger the Lord by not wanting to go into his land. They said, no, we'll go into the land. We'll leave if you give us this property over here on the east of Jordan, we'll leave our livestock and our women and children here, and we'll go in with all the other tribes and conquer the land. We'll fight until they've conquered the land. But then can we come back here and live with our families here, because there's a lot of grass for our flocks? God said, okay, go ahead. Now, this was giving them their request, but with it leanness of soul, actually, because they were then vulnerable, as the rest of Israel was not, to invasion. Israel had a natural barrier to invasion in the Jordan River. Crossing rivers was not easy for armies in the old days. In fact, they always had to come up from the north and come down. I don't think you ever read in Israel all the wars they fought that the enemy came across the river. So the eastern boundary of Israel was from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea at the river there. That's kind of a natural protection from invasion. But these guys got their land over here, and they got invaded and wiped out. So they bad choice, but they did inherit the land there. Chapter 33, we don't have to worry much about. It's basically a list of 42 different encampments that Israel camped at during the time they were wandering in the wilderness. 42 encampments. They're listed one by one. Their names are not important. We don't even know where most of them are today, but we just have a list of them. Yes, Brandon?
Do we know if that list is chronological?
I think it is. I think it's intended to be chronological. It's not alphabetical. So I mean, the logic would be that they kept track, of each town as it came along. They listed it down, so it'd be chronological. The thing is, though, the certain identification of these towns today would be a challenge to impossible. It's really, most of these places were probably just wells and oases. They probably didn't have civilizations in them. They were marked spots in the desert that probably where people gathered around an oasis to get water, and there had probably some nomadic people camped around it and they gave it a name. But those places would not be, in most cases, they wouldn't leave behind archaeological evidence of their existence necessarily, and we don't have other information about most of them. So we can't do a dot-to-dot kind of tracing of their journeys as we would like to in many cases. Chapter 34, it talks about the boundaries and the division of the land of Canaan. We don't need to go into that. The boundaries are pretty well known. Chapter 35 lists or talks about there being 48 cities given to the Levites. So I mentioned that earlier. These are called Levitical cities. They didn't have land, so they had to have some cities to live in with houses. So they got 48 cities that were scattered out through all the tribes, so that they were accessible to the other people, because the Levites had to teach the others the law and stuff. They had the law. Others didn't. So people had to be able to go to the Levites for advice and counsel and to know the law, and so the Levites were distributed throughout the country in all the tribes. And also 6 cities of refuge are said to be there. This is for the man who accidentally kills somebody and doesn't want to be put to death by the next of kin of the deceased, which is what would normally be done. They can flee to one of these cities. There's 3 of them on the east of the Jordan, 3 on the west of Jordan, so that anyone who has accidentally killed someone, the example is given, you're swinging an axe to chop wood, and the axe head flies off, hits someone else in the head, and kills them. Well, you've shed blood. Did you do it on purpose or not? Well, we'll let a court decide that, and that court's going to be in the city of refuge. You need to get there before the guy who's the brother of the guy you killed catches up with you, basically. And once you're at the city of refuge, they'd hold court, and if you're found guilty of deliberate manslaughter, they'd throw you out, and the avenger of blood could get to you, kill you. If you were innocent, you could live in the city of refuge safely until the high priest dies, or until you die. That is, if the high priest dies, you can leave safely. If you leave prior to that, you're vulnerable to the avenger of blood getting you. Interesting laws about that. And then, of course, we saw in the last chapter was follow-up on the female heirs, the daughters of Zelophehad, that they have to marry within their tribe. And that closes out the book of Numbers for us. So next time we'll take Deuteronomy. And I'll probably have to discipline myself to go more quickly through Deuteronomy, since we don't have the option of 4 sessions for Deuteronomy. We'll have to do it in 2. All right?